From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
From referendums on taxes and abortion to races for state Supreme Court justice, take a look at what else is on the ballot next Tuesday. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. Welcome and happy Friday to you both. We're now 4 days from the 2022 midterm elections, and the questions that are getting all the headlines, and understandably so, are whether Republicans are going to take the House and the Senate, take control of Congress, who will control governors' mansions in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. But there's a whole lot else on the bottom of the ballot, or sometimes on the back of the ballot, depending on what state you're in and what ballot you're looking at. Let's start with Illinois, where there's a constitutional amendment proposed called Amendment 1. And Alicia, I'll just read a line from it. It says, employees shall have the fundamental right to organize and to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing for the purposes of negotiating wages, hours, and working conditions, and to protect their economic welfare and safety at work, unquote. And my understanding is that a lot of the criticisms of this, the people who are saying that a no vote is suggested on Amendment 1, is that the term economic welfare is extremely broad and could allow unions to bargain over things like teacher certification and more general public policies, not the kind of thing that you normally think of an employer and employee sitting down at the bargaining table to hash out an agreement on.
Right. So I think one example that has been brought up has been potentially, though, it could allow the teachers' unions to bargain over essentially housing subsidies or affordable housing packages. Also, another example could actually even be bargaining over mask mandates in classrooms. Those have been lifted, but potentially if there were another COVID surge, the teachers' unions could seek to require that in collective bargaining agreements. There would be a whole host of provisions, pensions, those already to some extent bargained at the local level, but these could actually be further enshrined. You could bargain over not retiree benefits. Those wouldn't be able to be diminished. There's a provision in the state constitution right now that is a little bit ambiguous as to whether in the future lawmakers could reduce pensions or to what extent that they could actually modify them going forward. But this addition, Amendment 1, would seem to clarify that that could impair their economic welfare, and even if that provision in the state constitution were interpreted in such a way that it would allow lawmakers down the road or district officials in like Chicago or other school districts to reduce teacher benefits, that could be classified an economic welfare issue, and therefore that would have to be bargained and couldn't just be imposed by fiat by a city or school district.
But the point here, Kim, seems to be to tie the hands of any kind of reformist governor or reformist state lawmakers who might in the future come in. I mean, Illinois is one of the states that is facing real pension problems, funding for public workers, high taxes, residents that are fleeing the state, businesses that are leaving the state for more business-friendly states, more business-friendly jurisdictions. And so the question at some point becomes, how do these states, I'd put maybe New Jersey in this category too, how do these states execute any sort of turnaround, especially if the unions are going in beforehand and putting it in the state constitution that they have these kinds of broad negotiating powers that make it really difficult, even if the public decides that what it needs is a change of policy.
Think of this as big labor trying to go on offense, because if you put this in the broader context, over the past couple of decades, really all of the movement has been more along what you describe. So we've now got an estimated 28 states out there that are right to work states, which give workers an option not to join a union. That has been something that's been cascading out across the states. You've had more and more states attempting to deal with their pensions, make sure that public workers in particular do not essentially run everything that happens in the state, including the budget. Remember the big fight that Scott Walker had with public employee unions in Wisconsin. So this is big labor now trying to go on offense and not only put these vastly expanded privileges into law. By some estimates, they could run afoul or basically nullify some 350 state labor laws. It's also an attempt to make sure right to work never comes to Illinois, in that the amendment actually has a flat out ban on right to work being enacted in the state, but it's also meant to serve as a model for other left leaning states. And the unions have been very open about that. See, look what we're doing in Illinois. This is the best way to make sure that we forever protect big labor in our state. Why don't you try it in your state too?
Let's jump over to California and Proposition 30 there, Alicia. I know you've looked at. And is this an environmentalist proposal to get more electric vehicles out on the roads, or is this kind of a corporate bailout for rideshare companies?
Well, I'm not sure it's actually either. The rideshare companies, Lyft and Uber, they actually lobbied, or Lyft in particular, lobbied for this mandate that California has that would require that nearly 90% of vehicle miles by 2030 would have to be in electric vehicles. Right now, it's only about 2% of these rideshare miles are in electric vehicles. So this has now been imposed by the California Air Resources Board. The problem is that these companies, Uber and Lyft mainly, they contract with mainly lower income and middle income drivers. These are many minorities, part-time workers, some retirees, college workers. They can't afford electric vehicles. And so the gambit here by Lyft is they have proposed to raise the top marginal income tax rate in California by 1.75 percentage points, which would bring it up to 15.05%. That would be the highest in the country, a couple 0.2 percentage points higher than New York's. And they say 80% of the revenues, about $3.5 billion to $5 billion a year, would go toward funding EVs and charging stations, especially in lower income and middle income communities. Now, Lyft's thinking on this is evidently that they need these subsidies in order to encourage more of its drivers to adopt electric vehicles so it can meet this mandate. I'm a little skeptical that even if this initiative passes and even if these additional subsidies for electric vehicles are approved, granted, you have to remember that the California Air Resources Board is also going to be the ones in charge of deciding how to distribute these funds, and they may not decide to distribute them in the way that Lyft wants them to. So I'm a little skeptical that this will actually help Lyft and Uber. It will bail them out. Both of them, by the way, Lyft especially is struggling because it actually has a much smaller market share and doesn't have as deep pockets as Uber. So Uber could potentially decide to, subsidize its drivers to get EVs, whereas Lyft would have a more difficult time doing that. But going back to your question, whether this is, a corporate bailout or is an environmental initiative, this would do nothing for the environment, okay? And that's why a lot of some environmentalists and some environmental groups are supporting it, but also some members of the Natural Resources Defense Council have actually opposed it. Gavin Newsom is actually also opposing it. This goes back to kind of an interesting political story because the California teachers unions are opposing it because none of the money would go to schools and could potentially actually reduce funding for education. So this is actually a kind of interesting intra-democratic brawl over this initiative. The latest polling had it actually losing. It was up, but the No campaign started running ads with Gavin Newsom, basically criticizing it as a corporate bailout. And so it has actually fallen in support. But I think it will actually end up depending a lot on the more progressive turnout will probably help it on election day. Whereas if you get a more conservative electorate, I think it will go down.
The other one in California that caught my eye was Proposition 29. And this is a regulation of dialysis clinics, which sounds pretty specific. And it's even more fascinating when you realize that this is the third election in a row that California voters have been given a ballot initiative about regulating dialysis clinics. So this one specifically, and the Journal had a pretty good editorial on this, I thought, would require clinics to have a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a physician assistant on site during all patient treatment hours. And the dialysis clinics say that this is unnecessary, that it would raise costs. It would put a lot of clinics potentially out of business. The initiative says that they would not be allowed to close. They would not be allowed to go out of business without getting permission from the state first, and probably there would be a legal challenge to that. Why I think this is fascinating, Kim, is everybody looking at this seems to think that this is not really about dialysis clinic regulation. This is funded by a union that is trying to unionize dialysis clinics. And according to the LA Times, the union spent about $10 million to get Proposition 29 on the ballot. And the dialysis industry is spending more like $85 million to make sure that it does not pass. And so it seems to be a strategy every 2 years. We can do this asymmetric warfare against you unless you drop your opposition to having us come in and unionize your clinics. And Kim, that makes me wonder whether this direct democracy thing is really doing what it was intended to do. And I checked the figures. To get a constitutional amendment on the California ballot this year required about 1 million signatures, and it was less to do a statutory amendment. And if you're a union and have $2 million to spend, you can do that. But then we get all these strange intra-progressive fights, as Alicia was describing, between the environmentalists and the Lyft people, and we end up doing budgeting and tax policy depending on who shows up at the polls on Tuesday.
It is true that this particular ballot initiative should be getting people's attention because it's an example, and it's rare that you have this, but this is an example of how the initiative process can be weaponized, because this union doesn't care one fig whether or not there are X number of nurse practitioners or physicians on site in a dialysis treatment center. They're using and exploiting patients for their own union gain. They're essentially putting this up on the ballot and saying, we're going to cost you a whole lot of money every single year unless you finally give in to our unionization demands. And those numbers are quite striking about how much it spends to get it on the ballot versus how much the dialysis industry has to spend to keep it from going into enactment. Now, all that being said, I really feel strongly about the initiative system and the idea that citizens do have some direct access to the ballot. I think it's even more important in a state like California that is essentially one-party rule, and where Sacramento would forever be raising taxes and taking all kinds of actions if there hadn't been in some sort of citizen pushback against that on specific issues. Is there the need potentially to look at these systems state by state and make some changes? Sure. One example could be maybe, and I'm not saying I agree with this, I just don't know, throwing it out there, maybe you have some provision that says that if you have a ballot initiative and it fails, there's some time limit before it can be put back up to the people's vote again. There has been a movement, which I've been a big fan of across some states, to simplify ballot measures because there was a problem growing that these measures were getting longer and longer and longer. Essentially, they looked like statutes, and people didn't have the ability to fully internalize what they were voting on. So we've had a reform movement in some states where ballot measures can be more than a few lines long. So I think that there's always room for improvement, but I'd be very, very careful about ever pushing to take away this particular tool of voters.